to the next talk by Brian Dunkin. Brian is my junior in years, but he's my senior in many ways in the leadership he has exercised in this organization and for flexible endoscopists nationwide. I've learned a lot from him personally. He's now leading one of the most dynamic technical skills training centers at Methodist Hospital in Houston that I've seen. And Brian's going to talk about validating the tool, the didactics, the skills parts of FES, and also GAGES, the clinical tool that Melina alluded to that was developed to help assess the validity of what we're doing in this training program. Brian?
Thanks, John, and good morning to everyone. I think the only thing I'm leading you in, John, is the receding hairline, so I don't know if I'll take credit for anything more than that. I was asked to spend my 20 minutes here at the podium really talking about FES and the validation behind it, GAGES, which is a clinical assessment tool, and then kind of trying to bring that together a little bit on where that comes into our armamentarium for teaching flexible endoscopy, and more importantly, in understanding if people have the knowledge and skill to do it well. By way of disclosures, I really have none that are potential conflicts of interest for this program. And I want to spend the time explaining about what is FES exactly, how it was developed and validated, and how it's going to be used to test knowledge and skill in flexible endoscopy. And I really want to emphasize transparency. And it's important on these fundamentals programs, as we heard about with FLS, that the programs be developed with a rigor that can withstand scrutiny, and that there's a transparency to that development as well. And this is something that's unique to the fundamentals program. I would wager to bet that if you are not FLS certified, then you have never taken a validated exam in your life. Your board exam, your ATLS, your ACLS, none of those are valid examinations. They haven't gone through the rigor that these fundamentals programs have, and I want to explain a bit about what that means. So a brief history about FES, just to give you the timeline. This really sprung out of a SAGES board meeting in 2005 when the FLS report was being given, and Bruce Shermer kind of leaned over and said, hey, wouldn't it be great to have a fundamentals of endoscopic surgery, a lot like FLS? And some real leaders in surgical endoscopy like Jeff Ponsky and Nat Soper agreed to do that, and then they did the most important thing that they could have done with FES, and that's they recruited Jeff Marks. And so Jeff was recruited to lead a task force to help explore and develop FES. And as any good leader, he got a team around him, which included the staff from SAGES and some FLS leaders. And then he got his former fellow to help him shoulder the load, and that was me. So I had the honor of working with Jeff as the co-chair for the task force in the initial years of developing FES. And you can see that SAGES committed significant support to this from staff, and also a lot of work. If any of you have been involved in a fundamentals program, it's an amazing amount of work, but extremely satisfying. So this FES task force was put together, and the vision was this, that we wanted to develop an off-the-shelf program that would establish a baseline of knowledge and technical skill in flexible endoscopy. And this would really establish a minimum level of endoscopic proficiency. And when you develop this kind of program, you need to understand, okay, who is it that I envision will pass this thing? And for us, that was a PGY3 surgical resident who had completed a rotation on flexible endoscopy, or a gastroenterology fellow that had completed their first year of fellowship. That was really our goal for the minimum qualified candidate that would pass this thing. The key components of FES are just like FLS. We tried to learn from the lessons of FLS. So that means a web-based didactic program, a high-stakes written examination, and a validated hands-on testing tool. And I don't expect you to read this, but I want you to get an idea of the timeline and the rigor that went behind this. So this was a project that progressed quickly but carefully through the entire development of this program. And I want to step through a few key points of this timeline. So really we kicked things off in January of 2006 when there was an initial retreat, and at that retreat the members of the task force began writing really a textbook of surgical endoscopy, something that would become the didactic material for FES. There was an extensive literature review of all of the hands-on material that's out there. How could you possibly do a hands-on examination for flexible endoscopy, and what platform could we use to do that? And what we found was there really was no box trainer equivalent for flex endo that had any validation to it. And we began the process of developing that hands-on testing tool, and that began by deconstructing the task of performing flexible endoscopy. If you look at most simulators that are commercially available on the market, whether that's in surgical simulation or endoscopic, flexible endoscopic simulation, most of them have been designed exactly backwards. And by that I mean a lot of smart people get onto a room, they develop a virtual reality environment that seems to mimic the real environment, and then they take that to clinicians and say, can you show us, does this thing help you at all? And you saw by Dr. Vasiliou's lecture that for the most part we struggle to show that those things help us at all. The way you should design a simulator is the exact opposite process. You should look at it, what it is that you are trying to test, what you are trying to simulate. You should break that down into specific components. Hopefully those components have as little overlap as possible. And then when you have those components, then and only then do you build your simulator to simulate those specific skill sets. And what you find often is you don't need anything that looks like a real environment. You can create often a game environment which will accomplish your tasks. So to design the FES simulator, we needed a deconstructed task list for flexible endoscopy, and we began that process. We then had a manual skills retreat, and this is when we continued to flesh out the deconstructed task list, further explored how we were going to proceed with the hands-on simulated environment, and we began the creation of GAGES, which I'll explain more about at the end of the talk. But GAGES is a clinical assessment tool for how good are you at doing flexible endoscopy. And if you want to develop a simulator, and then you want to eventually show that that simulator makes you better in the clinical realm, you have to have a validated clinical assessment tool. And again, if you saw Melina's talk a couple of talks ago, she kept coming back to that same theme and all of the validation work out there. All these flexible endoscopy platforms were compared to performance in a clinical environment, but there was no validated tool for the clinical environment to say whether you're doing that or not. So this isn't fancy stuff, by the way. This is the hands-on task retreat. There's the gang working around the table trying to come up with how we're going to develop a simulator. This is Jeff Mark's famous muffin simulator. So this is just using things around the table to get the concept across of, okay, the scope needs to go there, we need to do this task, that task. And we actually were really trying to get a physical simulator like FLS, something that was low cost. And that was our initial goal. We hired a validation consultant. So when you want to write an exam and you want to have validity to that, it's helpful to have experts in that domain that can help you structure that. And there's a very specific process and rigorous process to do that. Part of that process was a job task analysis, and this is where you define the scope of the material. What is it that's important? What's not important? And of the important stuff, how is that going to be weighted through the program? We also did a little simulator fair. We put a request for proposals out to everybody that is involved in flexible endoscopy simulation. We said we need a hands-on simulated platform for testing skills in flexible endoscopy. If you're interested in participating in that development with us, respond to the proposal. And we had a number of industry partners do that. And the one that won that proposal was Symbionics, and that is how we decided to migrate this platform onto the Symbionics platform using what's the GI Mentor 2 platform. So when you take the FES exam, this is the platform you use it on. FES utilizes nothing that comes with the GI Mentor when you buy it from the company. If you bought one of these things today and you bought the modules that are on there, none of those were incorporated in FES. FES has completely new, custom-made modules that have gone through vigorous validation. And then finally, we took that GAGES tool to a multi-center validation study to prove that it was a validated tool, and I'll show you some of the results of that. We've also chosen a web partner to help with helping us get this all onto a platform, and we've converted all of that to a web-based platform. And we did an initial launch at SAGES in 2010 to kind of get this out to the community while we were finishing up some of the validation work. So where are we today with FES? What's the current status of the program? FES is complete, and that means all three components. So there is this didactic material that is available through a web-based format, and this is extremely powerful stuff. This is essentially a web-enabled textbook of surgical endoscopy that covers all of the things that a basic surgical endoscopist should know. There are 12 chapters in here, and it really is a robust knowledge base. There's lots of pathology recognition within it, which is an important part of the process. There's a high-stakes written examination. So this is a multiple-choice exam. It was done in conjunction with the test-writing consultant. The objectives of it were weighted, and we had buy-in and input from gastroenterology and colorectal surgery through the development of FES to ensure that we weren't missing any domains. And this became a web-based 75-question exam for taking for the FES. And then there's the manuals task, and I will tell you that this was the most difficult part of developing FES, to come up with a completely new skills platform and then put it through validation. That's rigorous stuff. We didn't have a mistells to plug in like FLS had, and so this was a lot of work. These are the 5 deconstructed tasks. If you do flexible endoscopy and we examine what it is you're doing during those procedures, I can put that into one of these 5 domains. So this is the deconstructed task list for performing flexible endoscopy. That task list was put onto this GI mentor, and here is the different kind of pictures, screenshots, if you will, of the different domains. And Jeff's going to give you kind of a real ride through this later in the program. This has gone through rigorous validation. You can see over 120 people have been tested on FES, having different levels of skill sets, all the way from novices to experts, so that we could do the validation work and be sure that the metrics of performance on the FES Skills platform held water. And I'm not going to go through all of the details of the data. In fact, I'm not allowed to share some of the data with you. But I want you to understand that this is an extremely rigorous process. Every metric on the hands-on platform encompasses an element of time and accuracy, and then there is a score for that deconstructed task as you go through this. And a lot of validity work has gone in. This is an example of one screenshot from Skill 1, and the validation to show that this has an extremely high reliability in separating out what we consider someone who's below that level of the minimally qualified candidate compared to someone that's above the level of minimally qualified candidate. So that's FES, excuse me, in a nutshell. That is the timeline for development, the components of it, and the validation that's gone through it. If you want to get some hands-on experience with this, go to the Learning Center this week. There's an FES platform set up there. You can get hands-on experience with the different modules, and I think you'll find that it's very powerful. So all right, we got this validated test of knowledge and skill. We've got a simulation platform that's unique. How do you know a simulator can make me any better clinically? That's kind of the holy grail of simulation, right, is make me better in the clinical environment. Well, to do that, as I mentioned, you need a clinical assessment tool. We need some valid way of measuring if you're performing well clinically or not. And that's GAGES. So GAGES is the global assessment of gastrointestinal endoscopic skill. And it's really the first and only multi-center validated assessment tool of endoscopic skill. So this is a report card. I can walk into the endoscopy suite, watch someone do a flexible endoscopic procedure, whether that's an upper endoscopy or a lower endoscopy, and I can give them a score across 5 domains. And that score will really categorize them into beginner, intermediate, or expert range. And so now for the first time, I've got a validated assessment method of saying, okay, are you good or not good at this? And work that needs to be done is to take all of that stuff that's been out there in the flex endo simulation world and now start correlating it to clinical performance using something like GAGES, which is really the only validated assessment tool out there. That's how we're going to show this predictive validity that's the holy grail of simulation. Melina presented GAGES first at DDW in 2008, and this was a preliminary study, but you can see that the correlation there for upper and lower is excellent, and we get very good construct validity in being able to separate out trainees and experts for both upper and lower endoscopy. So this is quite a powerful tool, and in fact, the Fellowship Council, which oversees minimally invasive surgery fellowships, has a program in place to try to incorporate GAGES into all fellowship as part of the evaluation for their fellows when they're doing flexible endoscopy. Melina also looked at GAGES as a way to say, okay, how does GAGES correlate with numbers? We're always throwing these numbers out. The GI guys think we don't have enough numbers. We think we do have enough numbers. The board says one thing, ASGE says another thing. How do numbers correlate? And do the numbers that we typically require for our residents have any correlation to the proficiency? And so really what she did was she compared GAGES scores to numbers of cases performed by surgical endoscopists. And interestingly, she found that GAGES scores plateaued at about the numbers that we require for our residents for board. So when you did about 50 or more EGDs or 75 or more colonoscopies, your GAGES score kind of plateaus at that point. It also illustrates that GAGES doesn't separate out a competent endoscopist from a master endoscopist. This is really to separate out, do you have a minimum level of competency or not? So what's the expectation? Well, FES is the first validated tool for knowledge and skill in flexible endoscopy. It will be rolled out as a package this year, and we expect it to be distributed first to FLS testing centers that have a Symbionics GI Mentor too, and there's a couple of dozen of those across the country. So this is going to be regionalized testing for a while, and the goal is really to make this an essential component of GI and surgery training. Now, I wanted to finish the talk a little bit about some interesting initiatives that have come up, and it's around this kind of push-pull between GI and surgery around flexible endoscopy. And I don't want to go into all of the details of what have happened over the last 12 to 14 months, but the gist of it has been that some of the GI societies have really called into question the requirements of the American Board of Surgery for residents in the area of flexible endoscopy. And it really has caused the board to look within itself and say, okay, what is it that we're doing with flexible endoscopy? And is the experience that we're requiring of residents a meaningful experience or not? And what is that experience supposed to accomplish? And it's kind of caused the societies to come together and work toward establishing a goal in training in flexible endoscopy. And in fact, what it's allowed us to do is develop a curriculum. And so there's been a multi-society effort through SAGES, SSAT, ASCRS, ASMBS, and ASGE. So GI and surgery societies have come together, and they have put together, at the request of the American Board of Surgery, a curriculum for flexible endoscopy that would span the 5 years of a general surgery residency. And at the end of that 5 years, and after completion of that curriculum, you would be classified as a basic surgical endoscopist. And there's a very specific skill set and knowledge base that's associated with that definition. And the hope is that this will add rigor and transparency to the training process for surgical residents. FES is a critical part of the curriculum. The knowledge base that was generated for FES is used in the curriculum, and the FES test is used as a valid measure of where you are in your knowledge and skill as you move through that curriculum. Dr. Truss is going to talk about the STEP program, which is another important component for the curriculum as well. And so I think that in very short order, you're going to see a rather robust flexible endoscopy curriculum rolled out through the American Board of Surgery. And as part of that, you're going to see FES become akin to FLS as a requirement for certification so that you can sit for board. That's a personal opinion of mine, but I think that that's the level that you're seeing the development and distribution of FES. So really, in summary, I hope that covered what FES is, how it was developed and validated, and some ideas on how it's going to be used. The rest of the program, you're going to see some interesting things on how you might rehearse your skills in order to be prepared for an exam like FES. And then we can talk more in a discussion about where this thing will go in the future. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion section a little bit later in the program.